today for an enlightening conversation is Sufi teacher, author and co-founder of Threshold Society, Camille Adams Helminski. Now, she's been working within the Mevlevi tradition of Sufism for over 40 years. The Mevlevi tradition is steeped in 750-year history. It traces its inspirations on the teachings of the 13th century Muslim mystic and most popular poet in the world today, Rumi. The aim of Threshold Society is to facilitate the experience of divine unity, love and wisdom in the world. It offers educational programs, retreats in spiritual psychology and practice, and books, audios and videos that are all accessible through Sufism.org. Now, some of Camille's books include Women of Sufism, Ramadan Love Songs, The 99 Names of the Beloved, and Words from the East. Welcome and thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. It's really a grace to be here together.
Well, let's begin about your own journey. Anne, what took you from being born into the Christian church onto an Islamic Sufi path?
You know, it's mysterious how each soul's journey unfolds, and growing up in at that time, interfaith family of part Baptist, part Episcopalian in Florida, you know, there weren't a lot of varied religious paths available. And so one looked within the Christian context to find a deeper comprehension and fulfillment of spirit. And as a young person, you know, that search continued to deepen, and I found within Emerson and the Transcendentalists, you know, something of a resonance. And it wasn't till later that I actually found there were some Sufi influences there as well. But going to university, I continued to explore different religious traditions and came across the poetry of Rumi and was just so touched by his capacity to express from the heart the journey of the soul and the beauty of the beloved, as he refers to God. So it, you know, more and more that was calling to me until eventually we found a connection within the tradition.
Tell me more about that connection. What happened and how did it evolve?
You know, through a friend, I had come across the poetry of Rumi, and he used to read in the Persian, you know, and it was just such a beautiful language. And then little by little, paths became woven, and I met my husband, Kabir, and we journeyed together and met various people within the spiritual traditions. We had both studied Buddhism in college and university, and had that sort of sense of mindfulness and a ground in a deep awareness, but still felt a yearning for a deeper heart connection. And we began to meet people who had journeyed to Turkey and returned to the US and were sharing something of the Mevlevi path, and then were guided to meet our sheikh, Suleyman Dede, who had come to the US. And by then we were already working to translate the poetry of Rumi, and our second child had been born, and we had named him Shams in honor of Shamsi Tabriz, Mevlana's beloved mentor and dear friend. And you know, so it was just a beautiful merging of the seas when we met Dede, because he was just such a beautiful example of a real human being of full heart and awareness and love. So we followed over to Turkey to visit him and began the journey within the Mevlevi path, and the family just keeps growing. So alhamdulillah, praise be to God.
Tell me a little bit about your own sort of, what changed for you? You know, nowadays everyone's sort of seeking transformation and they're doing lots of personal development, or types of meditation. I mean, what could you articulate for us shifted and changed for you with Rumi?
Each soul has a capacity to listen deeply, and Rumi himself says, we fly on two wings, the wings of aspiration, of yearning, of hope, and the wing of fear, in our tradition, the Sufi tradition, one speaks of taqwa, of this sense of real deep awareness of wanting to be in alignment with spirit and honoring that deep connection with the source of life. And Rumi really helps one to find that balance in one's life and that sense of companionship on the journey, that the friend, as he also refers to the divine, is always with us. And growing up in the Christian tradition, there was much I appreciated within that context, and also felt a real love for Mary. And yet within Mevlana's universe, we came to understand even more deeply the presence of Mary and the possibility of each soul to be as Mary, listening deeply to the Word of God and giving birth to that beauty. So it was a deepening of something I had always known, but as our Sheikh Suleyman Dede used to say, it's a coming to completion, and he would encourage each person to move in their own way, in their own time frame, in recognition of the beauties of the Quranic revelation, but also, for those who come from a Christian background, to recognize the beauties that were opened through Mary and Hazreti Isa, as we refer to him in the Islamic tradition. So it was not a radical change, but rather a deepening and a sense of completion, of coming into a recognition of the depth of one's source that is really the source of all humanity, and that we're all so beautifully interwoven. And in a moment, one soul may find nourishment, in one place, and then be led, until this recipe of soul that we each are is cooked. And inshallah, God willing, we might be of nourishment to others in some way.
You've gone through your own struggles in life. I mean, tell me a little bit about sort of your parents, what happened there, and how this path or tradition really helped in the process of what happened to you.
Well, I was gifted with two beautiful parents who were both artists, and my father really awakened in us, or affirmed in us, a sense of the miraculousness of creation and all of the beauties of this world, and the dancing of the light, on the leaves. And he was a botanical artist, and particularly painted birds and flowers and tropical fruits. And but then there was a moment when I was away in university in France, and suddenly received word from my sister that they had both died suddenly. And it was a heart attack, an accident that took both their lives in one moment. And it was such a strange mystery, as with anything so huge like that, for I was 20 at the time. And it shakes the foundations of one's world. And yet there was somehow just such a sense of deep mystery within it. And from that time, a strange gift of being aware of the fragility of this life, and the fact that in any moment, any of us may be called home. and the preciousness of each interrelationship, and how so much is given, and even in the midst of deep pain or difficulty, that opening through that is immense grace. And I've just been in awe of that. There's a beautiful passage from the Quran that speaks about, with every difficulty comes ease. It's a beautiful short surah that came through the heart of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, after he himself had experienced difficulty. And it speaks about, the opening of the heart. And, haven't we, God, increased your remembrance, and truly, with every difficulty comes ease. Truly, with every difficulty comes ease. It's even repeated, which is unusual in the Quran.
Yes.
And so when you've been emptied, continue to strive and turn to your sustainer with loving attention. And it's just such a beautiful holding, of hearts, and reminder that within these difficulties that crack open our hearts, it allows more light to pour through.
I have a story of my own to share on that just briefly,
Yes.
which was that particular ayat from the Quran was like really a healing balm. When we went through a tragedy. We lost a baby girl very early, or very late in the pregnancy, but she only survived for 10 hours. And I remember that evening, on the one side feeling just completely traumatized, devastated, shocked, in deep sense of sorrow and grief, and yet looking up at the Maldivian sky, which is where we were, and seeing 2 shooting stars. I mean, I didn't know at that time, 7 years later, I'd go on to have 2 beautiful children, but I remember that particular surah and repeating it, and I repeated it enough times to feel it was like just this healing light flowing in. And I remember when I first looked at the translation, I thought it was after difficulty comes ease, but it's actually with difficulty, as you say, and it's this sort of state of duality that we're in all the time.
There is that, and yet held within the unity, just as, the seed is in the darkness, and yet somehow it knows to reach for the light, but it has to crack open in order for that to happen and that growth to come. And yet it's all for the flowering and the fruit, it's beautiful flowers opening everywhere. And, we have the 99 names in our tradition also, and the sense of Jamal and Jalal, the beauty and the power that are all contained within the gifts of the divine and the divine presence and flowing and all manifesting interwoven in our lives. So, it's such an amazing creation and process of being a human being.
It really is, and I'm touched because, you're a mother, a grandmother, Camille, and yet this grace has poured through you to be able, to offer wisdom and beautiful sharings, for other people. And I'm just curious, how did you find that journey of mothering and also living your purpose?
It's so amazing to be able to give birth, and each soul who arrives is such a grace and such a miracle. Just these bodies, whether female or male, are just incredible. And so living in that beauty and these dear ones who came to accompany us on our path, for whom we're incredibly grateful, it's moments come wanting to share things with them and with other dear friends who have come to join us through the years, and with their own journeys of motherhood, fatherhood, just being human being, whether or not they're an auntie or, and there's so many treasures within the spiritual traditions for nourishment. And when there are moments of difficulty or confusion, sources to which to turn. And so it was this journey of the book of Women of Sufism arose because there were friends within our circle who I really wanted to share the sense of the feminine journey of Islam. And at the time, there really were very few resources available. So little by little, I would find a story here, a story there, and just, they began to pile up in my study over about 18 years until finally, they came together into a volume. And likewise with the book of the passages of the Quran, that began when our son Shams was 2, and I would take him to nursery school, and it was too far to go all the way back home, so I would go to the library and read Quran, and there were just so many beautiful verses I wanted to share with friends, and so I just started writing down, some of the ones, and little by little it came together as a book of reflection and meditation. So, who knows, says anything.
Just on Women of Sufism, I was really touched when I read a bit more about the Prophet's wife, actually, and I'd love to hear from you what you feel, or what you feel like sharing today about her.
Well, beloved Khadija, his dear wife, who was such a support, especially when the message of the Quran first arrived. And from what we catch of the story of her being, she must have been an amazing woman and so strong. And it was she who proposed to Muhammad because she had heard of how trustworthy he was. And then when the revelation opened, that moment when he returns and is just so shaken by the immensity of the experience of it, and she had the capacity to hold him in that, and to comfort him and just embrace that vastness that was pouring through, and call her cousin, who had familiarity with the Christian tradition, to also affirm, and stood by him through the difficulties of the early years and gave birth to his children. So we have in her such an example of a steadfast, devoted heart, who could recognize that depth of spirit and be such a companion of soul, that was always with him, it would seem. And, we have the blessing of so many women in the tradition over the years, and Rabia al-Adawiya, who was such an amazing presence, and was one of the first we looked to who referred to the divine as the beloved, so that sense of that deep, intimate connection with God that came through that experience of Muhammad, and reaches back in human history, but she opened it in such a beautiful way that then became the flowering of the Sufi language and the poetry, all the songs of the troubadours as it flowed into Europe, and the way all the traditions have interwoven over the centuries and through human hearts is just so beautiful.
Just on the Interfaith Node. I'd love to share now a clip from your talk with the Festival of Faiths that happened in May of 2018.
In the midst of darkness, we learn compassion. The prophets, the saints, the holy ones, all have borne the burden of weighty love, even some, like Jonah, in a moment reluctantly, with doubt of their capacity to enliven the mandate from the beloved, the source of life.
Camille, would you mind sharing a little bit more about this human struggle with love? How can we and where do we go to connect with that mercy when at times we're just overwhelmed with our own state of darkness?
You know, we are gifted with so many capacities, and sometimes we forget the full range of being. And, you know, in a moment, it may be the voice of a friend, it may be the fragrance of a flower that just reminds us of that deep beauty. And to remember that, you know, we have this gift of subtle awareness. We were just in retreat recently, and two of the names of God we were holding were Ya Latif, Ya Kabir, the infinitely subtle, the infinitely all-aware. And so to recognize that even in that darkness, that love is with us, and that it holds its own blessing. So if we can remember just to simply witness, you know, in that moment, rather than pushing something away, and to remember that there's a gift in every moment possible to recognize. And Shamsi Tabriz, the friend and mentor of Mevlana, had a beautiful saying, you know, that often obstacles come in front of us, or difficulties, and we may wish them away, but they have their purpose. And one of the purposes is to remind us that that friend is always with us, that we turn and turn again and ask for help, and remember to greet what comes to us as though it is our greatest happiness, he says. This is really a Herculean effort in some people's awareness, you know, and yet simply by opening to that possibility, he says, you may be reminded that the friend, you know, has so often before removed obstacles from your path, and could in a single second, you know, remove that obstacle with a single push, you know. And yet it's that turning of heart that is needed, and the remembrance that we are held within a beneficent universe, and even these difficulties are educating us in a deep, deep way to the fullness of our capacity as a soul. And that through these difficulties, as you know from what you experienced, you know, it cracks open the heart to allow a deeper compassion for others. And all the prophets, you know, have gone through so many difficulties, and it's so often a weighty passage to convey this beauty of spirit, and yet through that journey, so much beauty opens. So the darkness is not to put out the light, but to reveal it.
So listening to that, dear Camille, how can we take that and, you know, with our jealousies, our envies, the nitty-gritties, the angers that we face that come up for us, how can we take these spiritual messages and really apply it in everyday life?
Sometimes we need to just pause and reflect. Sometimes awareness of the breath in a moment can be a reminder. I mean, we have this incredible gift that's enlivening us all the time, and we forget. and this whole body is a mechanism of awareness and sense. I mean, even the skin, we forget it's an organ of perception. And so many graces are given to us to perceive and to hear, to smell, to, as Mevlana says, catch the fragrance of the sovereign everywhere. So even, as we said, in difficulty comes ease. And there's a beautiful passage in Rumi's Mesnavi. It's actually a moment when Asiya, the adoptive mother of Moses, is speaking to Pharaoh and trying to encourage him to listen, and all of these characters that are dancing through the scriptures, are really parts of ourselves. So that sense of the egoic person who just, refuses to hear, and Asiya, the one who could stand and witness the truth, even in a child, in Moses, to bring him into her household and raise him. And she goes to Pharaoh and tries to help him listen. And it's one of the beautiful passages that we love from Mevlana. And she says, "Listen, O drop, give yourself up without regret, and in exchange, gain the ocean. Listen, O drop, bestow upon yourself this honor, and in the arms of the sea be secure. Who indeed should be so fortunate? An ocean wooing a drop. In God's name, sell and buy at once. Give a drop and take this sea full of pearls."
Don't know what to say after that. It's so beautiful. MashaAllah.
So this ocean of love is waiting, in every moment, beside us, welcoming us. In a breath we can remember. And sometimes the compression is a bringing close. We also have these names, Al-Qabid and Al-Basit, the contraction and the expansion. But without both, our hearts wouldn't beat. Without both, we wouldn't be able to move. And what we perceive sometimes as a contraction, as a compression, that same word also has the understanding of bringing near. And sometimes in our expansion, we may disperse, and get lost. And we may need something of that pulling back to remember that deep connection that is always sustaining us. There was one moment that opened recently, the bees have been very present, and the flowers, and the sense of one of the difficulties in our world today is the challenges of the environment and all of us, and our responsibility. And we were back in France, where I hadn't been for many years, and I was thinking about the bees and discovered that in Paris they have made a pesticide-free zone. Because they recognized the importance of the bees. And, sometimes we forget the tiniest creatures are so essential to our well-being. And they're the pollinators that help create our food. And just, as an example, as a metaphor. And there's the beautiful passage in the Quran about the bees and the six-sided houses and the healing liquid, that we're provided with, and how that catches the light and is so nourishing. And, Mevlana also mentions in a moment in one of his poems, I asked for one kiss and you gave me 6. So we're created in this immense universe with all the 6 directions. And there is just this moment of reflecting with the bees and opening from there about our struggles a bit. It's the bees of your haven. Nothing would exist without your love, and this your is the divine you, the beloved. Nothing would exist without your love. Bees find their way to sip a flower's fragrance. We find our way to nestle in your sanctuary. Everywhere abundant, pouring sustenance through the keyhole to your refuge. Light finds its way through every crack in our defenses. The door you set, we forget to open, flies wide to welcome all souls who turn in recognition of the source of all that nourishes, all that heals our riven bones, our fractured hearts, our complicated minds, untangled, restored, stretched, we rest in the shade of your love, in the sunshine of your grace, upon the grass, soft as a willow's down, along the river's side, where the table is set, and all are invited, always and now. And this reminded me of this passage of the bees from the Quran, and also the beautiful passage of the Lord is my shepherd and leads me beside the still waters, and that table that is set always and now, and how the beloved is always calling us through everything that comes to us. And as it says towards the end of Surah Maryam, the surah in the Quran that's named after beloved Mary, bow in worship and draw near is a reflection of the verse at the end of her surah, which says, surely those who have faith and do the deeds of wholeness and reconciliation, the infinitely compassionate will endow with love.
I mean, often it's taking that first step, isn't it? It's the trust, it's sort of, I guess it's that intangible, staying out of the monkey mind, of overthinking. Well, if I, and doing it from on an authentic space as well. So, sometimes when you're caught in a reconciliation, you're almost trying to manipulate the outcome by saying, well, I'm going to be the bigger person. Do you know what I mean?
And yet we have to just allow space for the unfolding in the moment and offer our hearts, offer our full being to the moment, and with deep respect for each being. We get so tangled, and yet in a moment we can be called to remember and to recognize, another heart that's struggling on the way. And as Mevlana says, every, conversation you're having, it could be the last for this person. And remember that, honor each interaction and be with that enlivening breath of the one who is breathing us, and remembering that every darkness can bring forth the light in a new and beautiful way. Inshallah.
Well, thank you so much again, dearest Camille, for joining us today. It was certainly a beautiful time spent with you.
Thank you, dear one. It's really been such a grace to have these moments together.
Thank you.